Okay, so here are the different parts. The introduction paragraph. You have begins with an attention-getting technique or hook, right? So this means in the first two sentences, you make someone interested in the essay. So you're trying to think of a creative way to do that. You're going to give an overview of the issue, right? Whatever the debate is, you're trying to give an overview of that, a little background behind that. Then obviously you're taking a clear position one way or another about the subject, and you're avoiding using first and second person or talking about the essay itself, right? You don't want to be like, so in this essay, I'm going to, like, you don't want to do that. You just want to say the things. Um, so these are thesis tips, just trying to help make sure. I think I've looked at a lot of people's thesis statements, so people seem to have that idea totally down. But it's basically you want to know sort of what you're doing, like what you're trying to do, even though it's a rough draft. Instead of just being like, I'm just going to generate stuff, you sort of want to know, like, for example, right, that you are, is this a problem that you're trying to prove that a problem exists and how bad it is? Or are you trying to say that a solution should happen or whatever? You just want to be clear in your own head about what it is you are trying to accomplish. Okay, so this is the I don't know, diagram of an introduction paragraph, meaning it starts very broad. You do a hook, get someone interested, and then you're sort of giving a background, a general perspective of the issue, and then sentence by sentence, sort of step by step, you're getting more and more specific, and then you end with your thesis statement, right? At the end of the introduction, which is where you say, this is the thing, this is how things should be, and you give a few reasons why. Those reasons are going to be the things um, that you develop in the essay. So types of hooks, I know I posted this in a few other places, but this is just 6 different examples of ways to start an essay that can work to get the reader's attention, right? So types of hooks. You start with a story of some sort. Again, this would be a real story, not a personal story. Like, do not use anything personal for this. You would like find this in an article or something or resource, and then you should give that, and then you get into the essay. You could bring up the opposing position, and then sort of set out like how you're going to destroy it, right? So many people think this, but they're wrong or something. So that gets people. The creating curiosity is a little bit of a, I don't know, a literary thing, right? You're using language to sort of hide for a little bit what you're talking about, right? It's taking over our lives. We can do it almost anywhere. So, right, it's like you don't know what it is, and then they tell you this is texting, when it was first a big deal in 2018 apparently. Challenge a common belief. Most people think this, but here's the real situation. Historical examples also, like a little bit like the story, but you talk about something that's happened in the past, right? That gets people. You want the hook to sort of introduce your subject, but and be interesting. Posing the question, who's better at chess, computers or humans, right? So that's the beginning. Those are all just types of hooks. So you want to use one of those or your own. Really, the only thing is that it's interesting. Okay, now we are on to the body of the essay. Paragraph development. You need a clear topic sentence. So the topic sentence should be one of your main supporting ideas, right? So you have your main overall thesis and then your first main reason or supporting idea. That's what your topic sentence is. And then you want that paragraph just to focus on that subject, right? On that supporting argument. So this is the idea of discussion of the point at hand, right? You're just sort of making sure that you don't go off track, I guess. This is, and I mentioned this, I think, last week too, but a smooth, clear shift to source material. So this is you shifting, bringing in a quote, for example. And you want to bring the quote in using this strategy that I'd mentioned before. And then you present the quote, and then you follow up the sentence. Let me show you. I have this here. Um, okay, so here are some example quotes. These are quotes. Well, these first parts here, this is about just showing you different ways of citing an APA. The best one to do is to try to include the author's name in the actual writing, like in a sentence. So according to Kuntz, 2019, dot, 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 dot. Kuntz writes, and then that. But the whole formula for integrating sources, right, for that thing we just talked about, you need a sentence that sets up the quote. So this is like you're bringing up a specific subject, you introduce the quote, and you try to give it some context, right? So Kuntz brings up this issue and uses history as a support when she writes, and then you present the quote. So you want to make sure that quotes are always connected to your own language, basically, right? So you introduce it with your own language, then you put the quote, and then you have a follow-up sentence. This is where you are explaining what the quote means, basically, or you can think of it as emphasizing it or like reasserting it or whatever. But that's you want to make sure you do that. So for every time you bring in research, specifically a quote, you want to make sure that you do this thing: set it up, introduce, present it, and then follow it up with over on this side talks a little bit about different things you can do, right? You don't always have to do quotes. You can do paraphrases. You can do summarizing. In any event, all of these are also still need to be, you need to use citations, which for APA is always the author's last name, year. You only need the page number if you're doing a direct quote. And I'm not even sure if we still need that, like the newest update, but whatever. We're going to just say we do for now. Oh, right, because I forgot. All right. All right, so next. So in each body paragraph, right, this is, you're trying to focus on making an argument. So this is another instance when I'm talking about knowing what you're doing, basically. Like just bringing it into your head. Like, okay, so I am arguing that social media causes mental health problems in teenagers. And you want to sort of identify how you're going to make that argument in that paragraph. So am I comparing it to something else that teenagers do? No. Am I going to sort of contrast it? Am I going to do a cause and effect? Like, what am I just generally? And these are just, that's what it means by argument techniques. Just sort of knowing and using a technique to actually argue. Counter argument, for example, that's a very, sort of often used technique. And that is basically you bring up the other side. Some people say social media is good for teenagers because it helps them have a social life and so on. But while it is important to have a social life, it's destroying them or whatever. So that's what a counter argument is. You bring up the other side, you sort of show why it's weak and quite incorrect. So here are argument techniques. These are just all things. You don't need to use this language in the essay, right? You don't need to be like, so deductive reasoning says, or I'm going to appeal to authority, right? You don't say any of those, but these are things that you do when you try to make an argument. So for example, if you know that you're using an example to make an argument, then you want to make sure you focus on and explain that example thoroughly and make sure it helps you make your argument. Appealing to authorities is when you cite experts. So if you're citing an expert, you need to make sure that like the reader knows who this expert is, like why, anyone should listen to them. So you want to be like, Dr. Smith, chief neurosurgeon at the hospital, and so on. Like you want to make sure you give the credentials of somebody if you're going to appeal to authority. So these are all just ways, right? Things that you can do that help make an argument, techniques that make arguments. And if you know which ones you're going to use, then you sort of know what to focus on when you're writing. I know that I'm going to make a fact-based statistical argument here, so I'm going to try to present the statistics as clearly as I possibly can and emphasize them and really use them to try to persuade the reader. So that's the argument technique part. All right, then you have transitions between, and I'll do something with that, I think, a little later. But there's transitions between sentences, and then there's transitions between paragraphs, right? So you want to, that's in my mind, to be honest, this is one of the ones that people usually fix or improve for the final draft. It's not really something to think about when you're, doing the rough draft, but anyway. Okay, so 5 scholarly sources, right? So these are the journal articles and so on. Something to keep in mind is once you have your 5 scholarly sources, you can still find other sources. And you might be, you find like an article in Time magazine, right? It's not a scholarly source, so it doesn't count for that, but it's still a credible source. So you could use information from it. So the key is get your 5 scholarly sources, right? These are the 5 journal articles about your subject with studies in them. Usually it's a study that somebody's conducted about your subject. Have those, you're going to use those. You want to use a little bit from all of your sources, right? You don't want to have an essay where you use one source for everything. So your goal is to really try and spread it out. But then once you have your 5, you can always find other ones that are, to help you with examples or stories or whatever you want. Okay, set up for quotes and paraphrases, sources. This is all about sources and how they're used, basically. So if you follow my guideline, my idea before from you set it up, you present it, and then you follow it up, none of this will be a problem. Always use less quotes, right? So if you have a really long quote, putting that in doesn't do anything at all for your essay. So instead, try to focus on what parts of the quote you really need, like what part of the quotes are actually useful to you, and then throw them in a sentence that you write yourself, right? And you could do that anytime you leave words out. You can put the 3-dot thing, right? So according to Dr. Smith, quotation marks, and then ... 50 people find themselves something. So anyway, it's always better to pull phrases from a longer quote and then use your own words and to present them than it is to just give a long quote. Long quotes, think about that. Most people don't want to read those. Like if you come up and you're reading something and you see a really long quote, not interested, right? Automatically. But if it's pieces of the quote are put into the writing, then people follow it. Okay, the conclusion, you're trying to just think of different ways, so word choice matters. You don't want to just say the same thing that you say in the introduction, but you want to present, it's almost like the conclusion has to have the feel of like a final argument. Like in court cases, there's the final argument and the guy gets up and he's like, okay, so here's what we've shown you. We've shown you this, this, and this, and therefore that's the conclusion, right? So that's sort of, you want that tone or feel to it. You don't want to just say the same thing that you said, like exactly word for word from the introduction. Okay, citations, yep, you have the reference page. Everybody knows all this. Again, this slide or PowerPoint is in the discussion for this week.